I will really use a couple of minutes for presenting the second session of our conference related to the EUMEPLAT project. Have we never ever been European? Reflections on European culture and media. The afternoon sessions will start with, this time, more a lecture than a debate, unlike in the other two cases. We have the pleasure of hosting Professor Donald Sassoon. Today in the morning, I was recalling how important Sassoon's work has been for us, for the drawing of the project. I was talking about the culture of the Europeans and morbid symptoms. Donald Sassoon's last book is The Anxious Triumph, A Global History of Capitalism, 1860-1914. I can say that to some extent this comes as a sort of ideal completion of your work, as you had already worked on the margins of global capitalism, the opposition to capitalism with the history of European socialism, the spiritual constellation of capitalism with the work on cultural industries. In this book, it seems that you directly deal with capitalism itself and with the main force behind contemporary history, in a way that reminds us of something really important for the relation, the connection, the overlapping or the tension between this global pattern of capitalist accumulation and division of labor, its adaptation to national cases, and somewhere in between, this missing dimension, which is Europe and which everybody is actually looking for. So I will shut up. As we don't need any presentations. Everybody already knows Donald Sassoon, who, well, he's generous enough to be a member of our scientific board. What is more relevant is Emeritus Professor of Comparative European History at the Queen's College in London, and we know that one of the most important historians in the last decades. Title of the speech is Globalization of Capitalism, 1860-1914, again. So, Donald, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I assume everyone can hear me properly. Yes? I will go on.
I can.
You can. Well, I wouldn't say that's the most important, but it's important enough. Capitalism is a process difficult to define, since the presence of a few capitalists and a few capitalist enterprises does not make a society capitalist. Processes, unlike wars and regimes, do not start on a precise date. There were people one might call capitalist well before one could speak of an industrial revolution. Imagine, for instance, a weaver in ancient Mesopotamia who hires workers, provides them with the tools and the raw materials, and pays them a salary. This entrepreneur would be recognized by Karl Marx himself as a capitalist, since he owns the means of production, the capital, pays wages to his workers, and derives what Marx would have called surplus value from selling the cloth. Yet no one would say that ancient Mesopotamia was a capitalist economy, even though there were more than 13,000 weavers in Ur 2,000 years before Christ. The basis of the economy was agriculture, and trade and production were mainly in luxury goods. In Florence, between more or less 1340 and 1530, the wool industry had capitalist characteristics. Laborers constituted between 1/3 and 1/2 of the workforce of a city. These workers, part of the laboring classes, or popolo minuto, many were immigrant workers from Ragusa, which is Dubrovnik today, Flanders, Naples, Cologne, received low wages and had no rights. No one would say that Florence then was a capitalist economy. So the process of capitalist formation cannot be separated from the institutional integument, the state, which accompanies it. Even in England, where it seemed that capitalism developed spontaneously, and where free trade seemed the natural way, the right way, the British would add the British way, The country had been, at least until the first half of the 19th century, a mercantilist, protectionist country, a state of affairs that the fathers of economic liberalism, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, had never ceased to deplore. The considerable regulation and protectionist measures established during the period of British industrialization were abolished, but only once British supremacy had become entrenched. The most important of these measures were the Navigation Acts of the 17th and 18th century, which established that all trade between England, or Great Britain after 1707, and the colonies should be conducted in English, British ships, operated by English, British sailors, sailing between English, British ports. In other words, British shipping, backed by massive government funding, had a virtual monopoly of trade, seeing off its main rivals, first the Dutch and then the French. Shipping costs were further reduced by the successful British suppression of piracy in the 18th century, since this cut the insurance premium. Total supremacy, including colonial dominance, was achieved at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain had achieved control, in addition to India, of key colonies in the West Indies. When everything was settled, in 1849, the Navigation Acts were repealed, bringing to an end 2 centuries of legislative protection for British commercial shipping. Britain, as the first industrial nation, no longer needed to protect its industries, but needed others not to protect theirs. The others, to catch up with Britain, needed to follow their own path and develop their own rules, and they did, adopting protectionism when it suited them. Institutions matters. Capitalism needs a strong state, and it must be a state that is willing and able to promote capitalism. This had been the case in Europe. In the 19th century, in Belgium and in Russia and elsewhere, the state developed the railways. In France and Italy, it mobilized loans and offered guarantees. In Britain, it regulated the raising of capital by introducing the Limited Liability Act of 1855, a formal system of company registration, auditing, and a regulation of the process of bankruptcy. The post office was in state hands virtually everywhere. In England, it had been a monopoly since the 17th century, a monopoly considerably strengthened in the 19th century when mail delivery expanded. But the mid-1850s, mail delivery in Britain was completely under state control. In effect, it was a nationalized industry. By the 1880s, the modern encompassed virtually the entire world, not, of course, in the sense that the whole world had become modern, far from it, but in the sense that modernity had become a near universal goal. The modern is, of course, largely an ideological construct. Westerners took some of the political, cultural, and economic features of their most industrial regions and countries and defined them as modern. As they became modern, a cult of tradition developed. So this cult was modern, the cult of tradition is modern, because in traditional society, no one chooses to venerate traditions. They're just part of the cultural environment. By 1900, Britain was no longer almost alone as an industrial power, as had been the case earlier in the 19th century. The United States had caught up, and Germany was not far behind. In the decades before 1914, no single capitalist state was hegemonic, either militarily or economically. But the end of the First World War saw the extraordinary rise of the only superpower of the modern era, the United States. Its preeminence was due not only to its outstanding growth in the decades preceding the war, but also to its continuous rise between the wars. In the final decades of the 19th century, such a clear triumph for capitalism was not generally anticipated. By the 1880s, throughout the world of independent states, which then included most of Europe, almost all North, Central, and South America, Japan, China, some few countries in Asia, in Africa, there was Ethiopia. Throughout this world of independent states, there was a common recognition that it was necessary to modernize. And they took that to mean to embrace industrial capitalism. But the advance of capitalism caused considerable anxiety, even in prosperous England, and not only, as one might expect, among suffering workers and threatened peasants, but also among the middle classes themselves, who were afraid of potentially seditious workers, of economic uncertainty, of rapidly changing status of Jews, of Irish, of cholera, of smallpox, and above all of the poor. And they were right to be scared. The Industrial Revolution that had begun in England and was sweeping throughout the West, and the concomitant move of workers from the countryside to the cities was bringing about an unparalleled upheaval in social structure. This was not simply a change of jobs. It involved abandoning a life of tranquil poverty in a settled community for the unstable conditions of urban life, at times because of immigration in another country. Usually, though not always, this meant better housing and better food, but it also meant anxiety about the future. Anxiety is an enduring trait of capitalist societies, but it is part of a system, not external to it. In the past, the vagaries of the weather and the ever-present threat of famine, war, and pestilence were the main source of anxiety for the majority of the population who lived on the land. For most people, unacquainted with the notion of progress, anything new, anything unexpected was a cause for alarm. Then one could blame God, the sinners among us, or just bad luck. Not so with modern capitalism. Since it is so obviously a human system that rests apparently on the accumulation of the mass of individual decisions, it creates losers and winners by constantly innovating. And this chronic instability is the foundation of its advance, not a fault of the system or an incidental byproduct. Optimism and anxiety go together, since it is not unreasonable to assume that the years of abundance will be followed by years of scarcity. It is, after all, an ancient view narrated in the Old Testament. As Joseph explained to the Pharaoh, the 7 years of abundance will be followed by 7 years of famine. And I'm quoting from Genesis, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. So prepare stocks was the advice. This is a kind of pre-capitalist boom and bust. And such anxiety had been even more marked in the early parts of the 19th century, when England was like a huge ship sailing into uncharted waters. What would industrialization produce? By the 1860s, at least in Europe, the debate among political elites developed within a specific framework. The recognition that industrialization was an unavoidable imperative, and the fear, for the socialists the hope, that this would destabilize the political system. These elites divided themselves into various political tribes. Liberals, then the most important group, then you have the enlightened conservatives, you have the reactionaries, and you have the socialists. And each of these groups had its own narrative about capitalism, and of course, each narrative overlapped with the others. The liberal tribe embraced capitalism enthusiastically as an end in itself. Capitalist industrialization would wipe away feudal residues such as aristocratic and clerical privileges, liberate entrepreneurship, enable economic growth and prosperity, strengthen the nation, often the new nation, militarily and politically. It would enable progress and promote science. These liberals were the true heirs to the Enlightenment. They celebrated the individual as the maker of his more often than her own destiny, breaking away from the limits imposed by birth and caste. By the 1880s, however, most liberals, even in Britain, had abandoned their previous commitment to the untrammeled development of market forces. Such notions were no longer held dogmatically as a matter of faith, but only pragmatically when it suited the development of one's own national capitalism. Most liberals and intelligent conservatives recognized that capitalism could also be a devastating force and sought to temper its disruptive effects with policies of social and political reforms. Liberalism itself promoted reforms in fin de siècle Europe, starting at the center of capitalism itself and of liberalism itself. Great Britain, here, by the end of the century, individualistic liberalism was giving way to a new collectivist liberalism. This envisaged a positive role for the state in the solution of social problems and the establishment of a just society. The road was open for the great reforming liberal administration of 1906-1914 that laid the foundation of the British welfare state, following the example of Bismarck's Germany. The proponents of untrammeled capitalism were on the defensive, even in Britain. While Britain was moving towards the new caring and softer liberalism, on the continent, the older, authentic liberal position was still regarded as the last word in political ideology by much of the intelligentsia. It is often the case that laggard countries worried that they are failing to keep up with others, seek to modernize themselves on the basis of ideas that have become obsolete in the advanced ones. Thus, in France, by the 1890s, liberals dominated the universities and the political and economic establishment. While their British counterparts were having second thoughts about the joys of free market forces, French liberals still assumed that state intervention would cause more harm than good. The state, these French liberals believed, should never have been entrusted with the railways and the post office, where it would face pressure for higher wages from its own employees and for lower prices from consumers. French politicians, as opposed to intellectuals, like their counterparts in Germany and Italy and elsewhere, paid lip service to the principles of economic liberalism while exchanging public funds for votes. It became a well-established practice. Democratization empowered groups such as artisans, small farmers, and shopkeepers who feared the advance of capitalism. Democracy enabled them to lobby politicians and extract from them promises of tax concessions or restrictions of competition. Local politicians spend their days besieging the government to spend money on behalf of their electorate before offering a few hurried prayers to market forces in their after-dinner speeches. Government responded by introducing some taxes, reducing others, initiating public work programs, and subsidizing this or that enterprise. The economist who argued that there should be no political interference with capitalism, there's still some around today, did not understand the simple truth. Capitalism was not simply an economic system, but a way of organizing social relations. In order to thrive, capitalism required the existence of a supportive infrastructure and a wide consensus around itself that the capitalists themselves, often forced to think for the short term, could not possibly achieve on their own. The state and the institutions were needed above all by the new social class, the bourgeoisie, in the sense that the emerging capitalist system needed a centralized state with a civil service and a standing army and a legal system that regulated commerce, enforced contracts, kept workers at bay, and developed communication infrastructures. The old aristocracy and the peasantry of the 18th century were not so dependent on state structures. Such consensus could only be built by political power. How could this be achieved in democracies without vote-seeking policies? And if this required higher public expenditure and some degree of interference in the market mechanism, that was a price well worth paying for capitalist progress. This, of course, could not be calculated with any exactitude. The door was open for endless argument over whether or not the state had overreached itself. Even old-fashioned liberals were not sure where the boundaries of state interference should be erected. All agreed that the state should have, as Mark Weber put it later, a monopoly of the means of force. Most also agreed that some basic infrastructures could only be built and maintained by the state, such as roads and bridges, as Adam Smith had explained in the previous century. Education generated more debate. In principle, liberals were happy for those who could afford it to have most of it, but they also feared that if a state refrained from running schools, the priest would do it. Hence, the rapid development of compulsory and free state education in most European countries. If necessary, conservative reformers must co-opt the opposition, embrace their cause to make sure that nothing essential change. In the most famous passage of Tomasi di Lampedusa's great novel Il Gattopardo, it is by far the most famous passage, the young Tancredi reassured his uncle, Prince Fabrizio di Salina, that he had joined Garibaldi's revolutionary expedition to Sicily in 1860 to contain its radicalism. Se non ci siamo anche noi, quelli ti combinano la Repubblica. Se vogliamo che tutto rimanga com'è, bisogna che tutto cambi. Mi sono spiegato. If we are not there as well, they will set up a republic. If we want everything to remain the same, everything must change. Do you understand? Aligned against liberals, we find the reactionaries. I use the term descriptively, not pejoratively. Originally, the reactionaries, such as Thomas Carlyle, as well as a galaxy of French and Italian Catholics, wished to return to a pre-industrial age. The old days were always better, and change is always a change for the worse. The reactionaries longed for an idealized past in which everyone knew their place. They saw every novelty as undesirable. They were not always wrong. They disapproved of a new power of markets because it privileged the power of money instead of aristocratic values. Markets enabled anyone with money to obtain status, enhancing individualism. Although the reactionaries were beating the retreat in the last decades of the 19th century, their views influence all politics and still do. The socialists, above all in Germany, where they were strongest, wanted everything to change and nothing to stay the same. But like the liberals, they accepted the inevitability of capitalism, which they regarded as a temporarily progressive force. They shared with liberals a commitment to capitalist modernity and industrialization. They praised capitalism's systemic destruction of tradition. They celebrated the disruption of rural life with its absurd superstition and arcane religious belief. Following Karl Marx and Werner Sombart, they were convinced that destruction, in this case the destruction of a traditional world, would generate a new spirit of creativity. What Sombart referred to as creative destruction, a concept later theorized by Joseph Schumpeter, for whom the process of creative destruction was the essential fact about capitalism. Around 1860, the world entered a period of massive change and turmoil. In the Tsarist Empire, after the defeat of the Crimean War, Tsar Alexander II finally decided to emancipate the serfs and to introduce some timid elements of local democracy. The idea that it was necessary to imitate the West and hence pursue the goal of establishing some form of industrial capitalism while keeping intact the regime of autocracy. So changing some things so that the main things stays the same. Still in the 1860s, two major states in Europe were formed. In Italy in 1861, though of course the boundaries did not then include the Veneto, Rome, or the South Tyrol, Trentino. Germany was also unified in the 1960s through three wars, all led by Prussia. In France, finally, after a century of strife, the Third Republic was established and in 1880 consolidated when the royalist threat was definitely contained. In Japan, things went differently. The country, earlier than China, had been swept by a wave of enthusiasm for Western progress, though its adoption of Western mores proceeded quite differently. There was a revolution in favor of modernity and industrialization. This was the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Considering the importance of this event, it was, by all standards, a remarkably non-violent affair. The Meiji revolutionaries, unlike their counterparts in the United States or France, or 50 years later, the Russian communists, did not have a global ideology or universalistic slogans, and had no wish or ambition to inspire people in the rest of the world. They did very little to benefit their own class. Quite the contrary. They removed its privileges. They were nationalists who aspired to protect Japan and secure its place in the world. It was, of course, the nationalism of the elite, not one born of a popular sense of political solidarity. The Meiji Restoration blew all this apart and created the basis for the modern Japanese nation and hence for modern Japanese nationalism. In 1860, Yokoi Shonan, a reformer and a scholar, authored his verdict on the previous 260 years of Tokugawa rule when he explained that Commodore Matthew Perry, whose fleet had compelled Japan to open its ports to Western trade in 1852-54, had been correct in regarding this country as a country without any government. Although the new Meiji government included some advocates of the anti-Western expel the barbarians policy, even they soon realized that the only true defensive policy was the modernization of Japan. The Meiji Restoration was thus a bourgeois revolution, but one carried out by the lower ranks of the samurai class and members of the intelligentsia. Capitalists and merchants played no role at all, nor did the people, since there was very little popular social unrest. The main aim was to prevent Japan from suffering the fate of China and becoming a Western semi-colony. So as you can see, I'm looking at the 1860s and the various changes, Russia and the emancipation of the serf, Italy and the unification of Italy, Germany and the unification of Germany, France and the establishment of the Third Republic, Japan and the Meiji Restoration. The United States too underwent its own capitalist revolution. Not the independence from Britain advocated in 1776 and achieved at the end of the War of Independence in 1783, but its capitalist revolution was the destruction of a slave economy in the South. Slave plantations were an integral part of the world capitalist economy, but in themselves they were not capitalist and not particularly integrated in the rapidly developing and protected American capitalism. Two economies lived side by side, the strong plantation economy in the South and the developing industrial one in the North. The Civil War turned out to be the first great international military victory of capitalism. Barrington Moore called it the last capitalist revolution. It paved the way for large-scale industrial corporations, the creation of a national currency and a national banking system, and the establishment of Wall Street as a center of finance. The 30 years or so that followed the American Civil War had changed the shape of the country dramatically. The United States became the leading manufacturing country in the world, overtaking Great Britain. In China, matters went very differently. By the end of the 19th century, China had been forced to sign unequal treaties, not only with the United Kingdom, but also with the United States, with Russia, France, Germany, Japan, and other countries. In practice, China had lost its sovereignty, not formally speaking, but in practice. The failure to modernize was a major reason. In the first half of the 19th century, the Qing emperors had done all they could to prevent the modernization of the country. By 1860, reforms, after the ravages brought about by the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion, seemed inevitable. Some members of the Chinese intelligentsia recognized that China could no longer pretend to be the representation of celestial perfection. The scholar Feng Guifen, in an essay written in 1861, explained that though China was larger than the United States, France, larger than Britain, he wrote, "We are shamefully humiliated by those four nations in recent treaties, not because our climate, soil, or resources are inferior to theirs, but because our people are really inferior. Why are they small and yet strong? Why are we large and yet weak? We must try to discover some means to become their equal." That is more or less the story of China since then. The road to reform, however, was exceedingly difficult. Inspired by Feng Guifen, Zheng Guofan, one of the great conservative modernizers of the 19th century, launched a series of initiatives aimed at importing Western know-how. Zheng was completely committed to the preservation of traditional Confucian hierarchies, to order and tranquility in a world that had been repeatedly plunged into turmoil by wars, chaos, and natural catastrophes. But he also believed that modernization was necessary. The decades leading up to the First World War, those halcyon days before the era of murderous wars and massacres of civilians, the decades that the French and others call La Belle Époque, the Americans the Gilded Age, and the British the Great Victorian Boom. That was the period where global capitalism truly emerged, the period of the first great modern economic globalization. After the 1914-1918 war, globalization subsided and even went into reverse. Capitalism retreated into the igloos of its nation-state economies and their associated empires. Globalization re-emerged after 1945, reaching new heights in the decades following 1980. Similarly, capital mobility was very high in the period between 1870 and 1914, dropped during the 1930s, and then expanded gently from 1945 until 1971, before taking off rapidly in the subsequent decades. So capitalism is good, but it causes anxiety, it causes disruption as part of a system, and to deal with the disruptions and anxieties of capitalist industrialization, various strategies were devised. The first and probably the most important one is nation building, deciding who is part of a nation and who is not. Democratization is also part of nation building. That is, the extension of the suffrage and the development of political, social, and economic rights, including welfare rights, that gradually transformed people into citizens. and the role of religion in this process. Democratization enhanced the appeals of nationalism, which is essentially a 19th century construct. The precise makeup of nationalism would differ from country to country. But the early exponents of European and Latin American nationalism assumed that it would be democratic, in the 19th century sense of the word, that is, with numerous exclusions. Nationalism could become the ideological glue that held the people together regardless of other differences, by excluding the others, not on religious or class ground, as was traditional in pre-modern societies, but on a more or less invented ethnic basis. Not for nothing, Marx and Engels concluded their famous 1848 manifesto with their rallying cry to proletarian of all countries to unite, an internationalist appeal that went quite unheeded, not surprisingly, since in the same text they called upon the proletariat, if he wanted to acquire political supremacy, to become the leading class of a nation, to constitute itself as the nation. So there is this contradiction, even at the origin of the socialist movement, between the desire for internationalism, international solidarity, etc., and the fact of the nation. Nation building could also involve projecting the nation's power overseas by acquiring colonies. Principally, this was done by Great Britain, France, a bit by Belgium, and with far less success by Germany, Japan, and Italy. Or the increase in power could be done by expanding internally, by extending its territories contiguously, for instance, the Tsarist Empire to the east, the United States to the west, or by protecting national capitalism with tariffs in the hope that it would benefit some strata of the population. Colonialism, of course, existed in various forms independently of industrial capitalism. The Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese empires, however, were in reality remnants of an earlier era where these countries had considerable power. During the 19th century, Spain lost most of its empire. Portugal and the Netherlands managed to keep some of their colonies at great expense. They contributed little to national pride or to industrialization. But colonialism contributed to nation building in a number of ways, by providing an outlet for colonial administrators and emigrants, by promoting trade, by developing the military, and by building up pride in one's country as truly superior, what the French called la mission civilisatrice, the British and the Americans, the white man's burden, and other such fantasies. Along with democratization, taxation, and the welfare state, it contributed to the extraordinary development of the state under capitalism and of capitalism under the state, since colonialism is a form of extension of a state into overseas territories. Yet, between the state and capitalism, there can be no harmonious relations, but only constant conflict. The state, even when it is federal, even when it is devolved, and even when there is a division of power, is necessarily a monolith. There can be only one command center which rules, and the rules are decided by the state itself. Capitalism, on the other hand, is anarchic. It has no center. It has no single will. The state is anchored within a territory. Capitalism has global tendencies, both in its production and its consumption. Of course, states get together, make agreements, sign treaties, establish rules, but there is no superstate able to impose its control, whereas capitalism can reach out all over the planet precisely because it is not a monolith, precisely because it has no center, precisely because it thrives on competition. Capitalism runs where it can, where there are profits, opportunities, openings. Every failure of one capitalist is another capitalist success. Every crisis has winners. every triumph is temporary. As Schumpeter wrote, capitalism is like a hotel where the clients are forever changing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donald, for your lecture. I don't know if it's possible for me to see the questions. Otherwise, in case, please send me any kind of message. So I will start with my questions. The first one is, I have to say, a very straight political question. You were explaining the role of the state as in providing, we can say, the backbone, somehow, the social system related to capitalist labor revolution. The obvious question is, you think that there's a way for Europe to become what the nation states used to be? I mean, it's a matter of time, or there's something which really does not work and cannot work in Europe, in the European system? Because what is somehow strange is that even when, economic processes and even the risks and the threats are increasingly global, we do not have a properly European dimension taking shape. Which is your position here?
Well,
I don't know. I don't know. It's a delicate matter for you after Brexit, but
well, you know my view on Brexit. It's one of the stupidest moves of the British government in its entire history. I even wrote a long review of David Cameron memoirs, which I call the worst British prime minister ever. But that's a different story. The problem is how a state comes about. As a historian, I have to remind people that states are constructed from on high. That is, there is an institution which has monopoly of force, monopoly of laws, and so on. And then they decide, this is Italy. Italians did not know it was Italy. Sicilians were Sicilians, Pugliesi were Pugliesi, the Bavarian were Bavarian. So the state is formed from on high with a certain amount of regulation of force. There are schools which provide the more or less invented history of the past, nos ancêtres les Gaulois in France and Rome in Italy, etc., etc., etc. And so you have all that. It's created from on high. The European Union is an association of states. De Gaulle was right when he said l'Europe des nations, des patries. They each have their own things. They negotiate. It is very difficult to think that a political European identity can be established through the European Union, which after all has been going on for a very long time. And I can think, there's not even a European fiscal system. I mean, Weber went on about the state is a legitimate use of force. I would say what the state is really is tax collecting. When an organization can say, you are earning money and you're giving me money because I need it for defense or police, for schools, for this, for that, and the other. But tax collecting is a central thing of a state. The French Revolution started on a tax thing. The English Civil War started on a tax thing. The American War of Independence started on a tax thing. Europe hasn't even got a fiscal system. And it hasn't even got a welfare system. So Europe is very far from being anything like a state. And so I think in a way, one should think of a different model of organization in which states agree. But what we've seen recently is how difficult it is for politicians who are elected on the basis of national elections, who need national votes in order to become the ruling party, to tell them, vote for me and I will transfer powers to the European Union. I mean, even in countries which were enthusiastic about Europe, this wouldn't go. How can a German politician go around Stuttgart before an election, or Bremen or Hamburg, and say, vote for me, and if you vote for me, I'll give more money to the Greeks and the Spaniards and the Italians. I mean, this might as well commit suicide. So there is for all the talk about Europe, there is a lack of European solidarity where it matters, at the level of fiscal legislation, at the level of welfare. It does not mean that one should not make all possible efforts to construct an ever closer Europe, but without the idea that we are constructing a state, not now at least. So that's my view anyway.
Sure.
Of a convinced Remainers or Remoaners, as we say in Britain now.
This morning we had a session about Europeanization from below as a sort of bottom-up process. And we had Donatella Della Porta, Nico Carpentier, Barbara Thomas, as well as Charlotte Galpen, who made a presentation about the anti-Brexit movement and the pro-leave movement, the pro-remain movement there in the UK. She's at the University of Birmingham. We can say that as an historian, you don't believe that much in the possibility of building a community from below.
No. I do believe, but it's not necessarily going to be a state. I mean, if the Brexit referendum in Britain had been confined to those under 40 or under 45, the Remainers would have won. The vast majority of the young are in favor of Europe. But what does it mean to be in favor of Europe? It means to be able to go around Europe, to fall anywhere in Europe, to buy any sort of European goods without tariffs. It means a common market. It means that one is able, with a degree in England, to get a job in Italy, in France, in Germany. That is the idea of the community. It's not the idea of a state. So the two are not the same thing.
I would have one more question. What I find to be the most interesting part in your last work is this idea of anxiety as being part of being part of capitalist system. I would try to also, because we have some reason to believe that digital capitalism is really stressing this to its limit with some psychiatric excesses we are starting to verify. I will try to make resonate this book with the previous one about sintomi morbosi. We will work on European public opinion in our project in 10 countries. We don't have any English university because of obviously the consequences of Brexit you were mentioning.
Yeah.
And the feeling we have, maybe also due to COVID-19 and the sort of post-traumatic stress everybody is living, is that there is quite an anxiety among Europeans, among European people. So my question is, you think there is something specific to our moment, or this anxiety is simply part of the classical cycle you were describing after Schumpeter, basically disrupted economy, cycles of accumulation, and then cycles of crisis, or there's something more?
Well before Schumpeter, because Sombart also talks about these things, and Marx in his own way, it's not an invention. It's not a discovery of Schumpeter. I would like to distinguish between two things. One is anxieties which are built-in capitalism, and then anxieties which are caused by other factors. So if you take the anxiety caused by COVID, one had a Black Death in Europe quite a few centuries ago. That must have caused anxieties. The people who died of a Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, we don't know how many. 25 million is the lowest figure I've been able to find. Some say 50 million, 60 million. And yet the Spanish flu is completely forgotten. It's only now it's been revived a bit. But it's not in novels, it's not in films, it's not in anything, unlike the First World War. Then there are anxieties to do with wars and so on. But these are old anxieties. They're anxieties which existed before capitalism. I wanted to stress that anxieties within capitalism, caused by capitalism, are to do with the dynamic nature of a capitalist system itself. The fact that if you are winning, someone will invent something which will completely destroy your advantage. And that if you are losing, you're wondering what's wrong with you because the others are winning. And it's not bad luck. If someone else dies of COVID, you can say, well, I'm lucky. But if someone makes $1 million and you're unemployed, you're beginning to think either that there's something wrong with you, there's something wrong with the system. It's not fate. It's not just bad luck. Because you have all the sort of things that you can examine. So the capitalist system always will have, by definition, winners and losers, and the winners are never certain to be always winning. If you take the top 10 on the stock exchange in New York in 1900, and you look at the top 10 now, apart from, I think Exxon is still there, but all the others have gone. 20 years later, you had a Ford company. Now in the top 10, you have Microsoft, you have Apple, you have these things. So the changing is extremely powerful. It's extremely important. And of course, I'm no specialist on that. I mean, there's no doubt that the internet and digitalization will involve a new set of anxieties. But I mean, the introduction of machines involved anxieties. You had machines to make cars. You had people who were making the cars, and then robots could make the cars themselves. So you lost your job. On the other hand, new jobs were invented to make the robots which made the cars and so on. So there is a constant movement, a constant shift. The big difference now with the period I was dealing with in my talk, with the period 1860 to 1914, the big difference is that capitalism is now really global, is that people are worried about China, because China is the largest manufacturing country in the world, whereas we, don't really make stuff much anymore. We make ideas. The United States has the idea of Facebook, of software, of this and that, but the people who are actually making the computers and all that, Foxconn in China, are the underpaid. How long will they want to be underpaid? And all the nonsense at the G7 about the threat from China. It's not a military threat from China. China has one and only one base outside China. The United States has 80 military bases outside the United States. The threat from China is that they're acquiring enormous economic power. In other words, they're entering the capitalist system. So the great paradox is that 50 years ago, one would say, oh God, China, poor things, they're under Mao, under communism. What they really want is capitalism, but we have to make sure that communism does not expand. And the Chinese said, well, okay, we're not going to be communist anymore. We're going to be capitalist. And we are still saying, oh my God, Chinese are capitalists now, they're going to take our markets and so on. So there is an anxiety which is precisely built around the ever-changing environment in which we live.
My very last question, you were saying anxiety, you were connecting the anxiety also to the middle class condition, saying that basically rich societies are even more affected than anxiety than what we consider, well, let's say, less technologically advanced societies. I mean, as a matter of fact, this is something quite frequent, anxiety and depression in the middle class, or on the other hand, for instance, populist movements and xenophobic movements which are arising even in countries that are not so affected by immigration, even though then migration is the main issue they use. How do you see this, let's say, disconnection between the feeling and the material state? UK is overall a wealthy society, but you had Brexit and Europe.
Yes, one of the paradoxes is a gap between the understanding of reality and how people vote. The current survey shows that the most anti-immigrant views are held in Hungary and Poland, which have no immigration to speak of, and the lowest, proportionally speaking, is France and Britain, which actually have quite a lot of immigrants. But the fact to have a lot of immigrants, you also know that they're doing all sorts of useful work. It's enough to walk into a British hospital and you realize that half the nurses are actually not Paka English, that they were either born abroad or their parents were born abroad. Similarly, the most Brexiteer region was Cornwall in Britain, which is the poorest English region and the one which is dependent the most on EU funds. Whereas the least in England, the least Brexit area was London, which is the wealthiest. So there is always a disconnect between the reality of things and the way people express themselves. The middle classes appear to be more anxious, but also because they talk more, they write more, they're interviewed more, they know journalists and television people. In other words, the noise, the middle class noise is always going to be higher than the working class noise. And as for the peasant noise, it's virtually non-existence, because if you are on the land, you just work the land and you just hope for the best. I just want to give you an example. Towards the end of the 19th century, Romania was the fourth largest exporter of wheat in the world. The agriculture was extremely backward, horses and that kind of stuff. Then the Americans developed the tractors. The international price of wheat went down. That ruined the Romanian wheat growers. They had to find a reason why. They did not, of course, understand about globalization. This is because of tractors in the United States. I can't sell my wheat. So they blamed the intermediaries in Romania who happened to be Jewish. And so there were pogroms against the Jews. I mean, the whole thing, strictly speaking, doesn't make any sense if you look at it with full knowledge, but makes an awful lot of sense if you look at it from a point of view of the Romanian peasant, because he doesn't know about America. He doesn't know even America exists. He doesn't know about tractors, but he knows about the Jew who is no longer buying his stuff or wants a lower price because of American competition. So the problem is almost a universal one, that the transmission of information is in the hands of relatively few people. It's always been like that. And the consequence of lack of information is quite staggering.
Okay, Donald, thank you very much for your time, your lecture, for all the inputs you gave us, and look forward to meeting you, hopefully in presence. Also,
yes.
We'll invite you to Milan. Hope you'll be back again. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, and good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you, and we can hook up at 4:30 for the last session.